So my name's Alistair. I'm going to talk to you about lean analytics. You're probably sick of the word lean already, almost as sick as you are the word growth hacker. So I'm going to avoid terms like that too much. How many people here have read the book, The Lean Startup? How many people here have finished reading the book, The Lean Startup? See, I know from all the Kindles how many chapters people get through on our book, and you can actually do like a histogram of page completion, and we put Easter eggs in the book, and every now and then we get like a tweet that says, hey, I read the Easter egg, which is a great way to test whether things are out there, because we analyze everything. We're analytics guys. So Ben and I wrote this book because we found that the Lean Startup was a great model, but people wanted more depth on the measurement phase. So I'm going to talk about that a bit. I'm going to assume that you guys have a good sense of what startups are, the basic ideas behind Lean. The most fundamental idea behind the Lean Startup movement is that Kevin Costner is a lousy entrepreneur. Because if you remember the movie The Field of Dreams, the premise of the movie was if you build it, they will come. The reality should be if they come, you will build it. And so you should not sell what you can make, but rather make what you can sell. And the Lean Startup is really a system for making sure that happens. This is the core message behind the Lean Startup book that Eric Ries wrote, that everything is a constant cycle of building, measuring, and learning. And your ability to iterate through this cycle as quickly as possible with the most learning possible will give you the greatest likelihood of success. This is pretty common evidence. The problem with this, of course, is that we have very few ideas about what we're going to be when we wind up being a full-fledged company. So, for example, PayPal was originally built to do payment across Palm Pilots. FreshBooks was a web design firm that had a problem with its invoicing systems. Wikipedia was going to be written by experts only. Mitel was one of my favorite examples, is a lawnmower company, Mike and Terry's Lawnmowers. That's Michael Copeland and Terry Matthews. That's why the logo looks like spinning blades, by the way. Hotmail was a database company. You guys have probably heard the apocryphal story. These two people wanted to work at their day jobs and communicate about this database they were building, and DFJ didn't care about the database. They cared about the fact that these guys could use their email from work and circumvent the company. Flickr was going to be a massively multiplayer online game. Twitter was a podcasting company. Autodesk, if you've ever wondered why it has a name like that, was initially making desktop automation software. So none of these companies that you've probably heard of, most of them, had any idea what they were really going to be, or at best they had a sort of hypothesis they want to go test. And the reason that we need a lean startup model that is sort of driven by informed learnings from metric is because we're all liars. And I put myself in that camp too, but we are all self-delusional. We love to build things. We're convinced that we're the right person, we're the smartest person, and why can't these people possibly understand me? Now, you guys have already cleared at least one hurdle, which is that you've managed to convince people like Ken that either he has similar delusions or you have some evidence that you're right. But when you have a first idea, the problem is your tendency is to want to go build it. So if you look at this cycle that Eric Ries puts together, in that cycle, hey, everyone's idea is the best idea, right? I mean, that's just a given. And people love the part where they build it because they came from maker backgrounds or engineering backgrounds. We want to build something tangible. It's a nice, reliable, mental model. It makes our amygdala all happy that we've got this real thing in front of us. We tend not to measure it or put it in measurement as an afterthought. And as a result, there's not a lot of data as we cycle around this thing. And our goal is to fix that because analytics is kind of like your therapist. Analytics can tell you when you're delusional. It can help you understand whether you're right or not. And so the best way to think about analytics is it's essentially the measurement of the movement of your community, your users, your revenue towards the business goals you've set for yourself. And in a startup, that means that it has a very specific role, which is to help you find the legendary, mythical product market fit unicorn before you run out of money or before your investors lose patience with you. We are terrible at doing metrics. So I'm going to use an example for this. I have 2 kids. At least one of them is a girl. What are the chances that the other one is a boy? How many people say 50%? Does anybody want to chime in? How many people on the Hangout think it's 50%? I have 2 kids. At least one of them's a girl. What are the chances the other's a girl? How many people would like to say it's 50%, but they know I'm tricking them? Right. So this is a great example of how bad we are at data. Will you all agree with me that I have 4 possible combinations? Boy, boy, girl, girl, boy, girl, girl, boy. Those are the 4 possible permutations of birth I might have, correct? I said at least one was a girl, so we know it's not this one. Of the remaining ones, how many are boys? 66%. That's a pretty simple question. Someone says to you, I have 2 kids, at least one's a girl. Your temptation is to say, oh, there's an equal chance the other one is a boy or a girl. But because I said the words at least, I've conveyed 16% inaccuracy on what you thought was the state of the world. We are terrible at data. So even when you're doing data collection, these kinds of paradoxes and problems, you've probably heard of things like the Monty Hall problem, Bayesian statistics. There's lots and lots of stuff that can trip us up. And we have to be very disciplined about how we capture data and what we do about data. So before we get too deep into lean analytics, I'm going to give you some examples. By the way, this is called the two-child paradox. I actually have one daughter. She's at the Academy of Sciences, having a great time without me right now. But this kind of stuff trips us up. This is called the two-child paradox. If you Google it, it's quite interesting. Or you could Bing it. That'd be fine too. So there's, whoa, cold crowd. So here's some fundamentals. First of all, do I have to put like money in a jar when I do that? Is that? So what makes a good metric if you're trying to understand your business? First of all, a metric has got to be understandable. The goal of a metric is to produce some change. And if your metrics aren't understandable or they're understandable to you but nobody else, they're not good. This is a hard test because everyone thinks their metrics are understandable. They should be no more complicated than a golf score. Bowling scores are more complicated than golf scores. So you need a really, really simple metric if it's going to produce change within an organization. It should be comparative. Without context for knowing what it's compared to, your competitors, last month, whatever else, it's not very useful. It's usually a ratio or a rate. Miles per hour is a more useful metric than miles when it comes to driving a car. But finally, and most importantly, it is behavior changing. A good metric will fundamentally change your behavior. The simplest rule for analytics is if it won't change your behavior, it is a bad metric. You may need to collect some forms of data for your accountant or to make sure that the website is up, but it's not changing your behavior until it goes down. But fundamentally, when you're spending time on metrics, ask yourself, what will I do if they are one way or another? And if you don't have an answer, you probably shouldn't waste your time and you should find better metrics. If a metric won't change your behavior, it is a bad metric. Metrics really help you know yourself. And yet, when we interviewed people for the book, we found that most people don't spend a lot of time looking at those metrics. For example, here's a way of understanding the metrics that your business might have, looking at the customers that are going to buy from you a second time within 90 days. Let's say you're a retail store. If your customers buy from you, if less than 15% of your customers buy from you within a 90-day window, you are what's called an acquisition mode e-commerce company. If they buy from you, if more than 30% of them buy from you within a 90-day window, you are a loyalty mode e-commerce company. There's nothing bad about being in acquisition mode or loyalty mode. Acquisition mode companies, for example, diamond ring merchants. Someone's buying from you more than once a year, there's probably something strange about that customer, a little bit creepy. On the other hand, if you're a grocery retailer, someone might be buying food from you once or twice a week. Very high loyalty focus. Nothing wrong with being one or the other. But once you measure what percentage of your customers buy from you a second time in 90 days, that changes your entire marketing outlook. Because if you are a loyalty-focused company, you want to focus on things like favorites lists and variety of selection and loyalty. You want to have wish lists. If someone calls you and says, my fruit was rotten, you immediately send them a basket because you want them to be a customer for life. On the other hand, if you're an acquisition focused, you focus on your customer cost of acquisition, maximizing checkout amount. Maybe you're selling ring cleaning and ring insurance services for your wedding rings. You do not accept refunds. Very different marketing behaviors that come from a metric like this. Astonishingly, the number of e-commerce retailers I've talked to that actually know what percentage of their customers buy again in 90 days is very small. There's nothing wrong with being loyalty or acquisition focused. There's everything wrong with not knowing which category you're in. So that's the kind of metric you need to spend time looking at in business. Some other important aspects of analytics. Analytics is often about blending qualitative and quantitative metrics. Often earlier stage in the life cycle of the company, you're doing a lot of qualitative discovery, user interviews, open-ended questions, exploratory stuff. Later on, you're trying to quantify that stuff into much bigger groups. You're trying to be analytical. But there is a very important need for both, and you need to compare across them to get information. The city of Boston issued an app called Bump Map that basically sat in your car, used the smartphone app to measure whether you hit potholes. They got a heat map of where to fix potholes in the city. What it did was tell them which roads in rich neighborhoods they should repair, because only rich people had unlimited data smartphone plans and a good smartphone in their car when they weren't riding on a bus to work. Here's a great example where the quantitative data said these are where all the potholes are. But if you temper that with qualitative data, like I went and looked and there's a lot of potholes in the poor neighborhoods, all of a sudden you realize your algorithms are wrong. So anytime you're looking at quantitative data, it's very important to temper that with qualitative data. There's another important aspect of the data you're going to collect. Some of it is exploratory, and some of it is reporting data. Exploratory data is the interesting, cool stuff that shows you the what-ifs. Reporting data is the stuff that becomes managed by exceptions, sort of set the alert and don't think about it. The person who knew the most about this, of all people, was Donald Rumsfeld. I'm channeling Avinash Kaushik talking about Donald Rumsfeld. But Rumsfeld once said, hey, there's things we know, which are facts, which we may want to check, but they're facts. We consider them to be true. There's things we don't know. These are questions like, what was sales last week? Those are boring. They're not going to change my behavior, except maybe firing the salesperson. But I do need to report them, and I do need to pass them on to accounting. There's things we don't know we know. That's intuition. It's sort of muscle memory. It needs to be communicated to the team. It needs to be quantified. It needs to be codified into processes. And then there's things we don't know. And this is exploration. This is usually where where competitive advantage comes from, because you're finding insights in the data you didn't know were there. So metrics tend to fall into one of these categories. I'm going to explain some stuff that might seem basic, but I want to review it. Imagine I have a web application, and it has 1,000 users a month that sign up for it. And in my first month, I get 1,000 users in January, and the product's not so great, so they come in, and most of them leave over the period of the next 2 or 3 months. And then the next month, I launch another version of my product that's better, so these users tend to stick around for a little longer, and then the March users stick around for a little longer still, and here's my April users, my May users. So usage patterns tend to look like this. Now, the users that had the experience of the May app, which may have been awesome, the purple stuff, had a very different set of experiences from those that came in my ugly January minimum viable product. So we call that a cohort when you slice across that longitudinally. I apologize if you understand stats really well and know this stuff, but it's worth stating. A cohort is a group that has something in common across its lifespan. In this case, they had an experience with my April product. And then I may slice across these things cross-sectionally instead of longitudinally, and I have segments of groups. So I may say all the people that came to my website on a sunny day versus a cloudy day, or all the people whose name begins with A versus B, whatever that segment is. And I may manufacture those in the forms of tests. So A/B tests. I think there's a Google blog post called 50,000 Shades of Blue about optimizing the right color for search results. Basically, this is tests that you can enforce. Most of us are not lucky enough to have the volume of traffic of a Google, which will allow us to do very simple, quick A/B tests. And so we tend to resort to multivariate analysis, where we have several different things we think are somehow correlated with a particular outcome. And so we run a multivariate test, let's say sunny and cloudy days, and whether they saw a red or green button. And then we do regression to figure out which ones correlate with the behavior we want, someone spending money or clicking on a search link or inviting a friend. So this basic taxonomy is pretty important. Cohorts, cross-sectional analysis or segmentation, multivariate testing, A/B testing. Let me give an example of why it's important. I'm going to show you 2 companies. You tell me which one's doing better. So here's our first company. This company is getting 1,000 new users a month. In the first month, the average revenue per customer is $5. The next month, the revenue per customer drops to $4.50, then $4.33, then $4.25, recovers a little in May to $4.50. Show of hands here or online, if you want to just type in whether you think so or not. How many people think this company is doing really well? How many people think this company is doing really badly? How many people think this company is stagnating? So it's interesting, you guys said there's not enough data. What's missing? I said it's 1,000 a month. How many people think it's doing really well? Stagnating? Badly? Most people say stagnating. I'll show you a second company, okay? In this case, I'm going to show you the data a little differently. So in this case, I'm going to map the data to cohorts. Here's a company, and in January, these are the users that show up in January, they get $5 a customer. And over the next 5 months, the revenue they get from those customers who had the lousy experience with the January cohort, that drops to about 50 cents. Next month, February, so it's the second month here, those users bring in $6 in their first month, so that's good. The next month it goes up to $7, then $8, and finally $9. So these guys have almost doubled first month revenue, and The decline in revenue, which went from $5 down to 50 cents, is now 7 to 6 to 5. So even the decline is better. How many people think this company is doing really well? How many people think it's doing badly? How many think it's stagnating? How many know they're the same company? This is exactly the same data. Let me show you it a different way. In this case, I have a cohort. In their first month, they're getting $5, and then it declines. So the average for first month is $7. But in the second month before, what I was doing is I was taking the first month of January, the second month of January, and the first month of February, and average those out, it started to look pretty bad, right? So what was happening is my January users who were declining and not spending as much and not as happy were dragging down my really awesome May users. The ones that were still around were just miserable and they were messing up my data. The user experience for the January cohort was very different from that of the May cohort. I know founders who've walked into VC firms, been turned down for funding by showing the first graph, put it into cohorts, and been given a higher amount of money for their round than they actually asked for. They went from unfundable to oversubscribed round because they displayed it as cohorts, not as averages. And yet most people, when they are doing measurements, do 3-year plans where they look at averages and they don't think about cohorts. This is a hugely important problem because you are in the business of iterating quickly. Each iteration deserves its own cohort. It has a new set of experiences with a new set of assumptions. If you're not looking at it that way, then you are probably missing very important things about the health of your product or service. And none of you will ever trust me again since I lied about how many kids I have and that I had 2 companies. So everything else I say is suspect. Another important difference in data is the difference between a lagging and a leading metric. A lagging metric shows you what happened, right? If I know what sales were, if I know what, if it's sort of what happens after the horse left the barn. If I know what sales were, yeah, I'm going to know what revenue is. But lagging metrics are like I recorded sales after they happened. A leading metric is something that allows me to predict the future. So if I know my pipeline, it's a predictor of sales. There was a growth hacking conference that happened here in 2012. Many of the big social media platforms and other online properties explained what they looked at as leading metrics. So for example, Twitter knows that if you follow a certain number of people and they follow you back within a certain amount of time, you are likely to become a highly engaged user. What does that tell you about app design for Twitter? It tells you you should probably have a lot of stuff that says, here, follow these people. And the people Twitter suggests not only are people you want to follow, but also people that are likely to follow you back. Because that's going to lead to behavior you want. In fact, this whole idea, yes?
So what about the causative versus correlative?
I'll get to causation and correlation, causality and correlation in a second. That's a very good question. So a leading metric may just predict the future. If you find a leading metric that is causal, now you can change the future. That's a superpower. So causal metrics, correlated metrics are very good because you can predict the future. Correlated metrics are not. And so since you asked the question, it's time to talk about correlation. Thank you very much for that incredibly smooth segue. So there's a known correlation between ice cream consumption and drowning. How many people think we should abolish ice cream to save drowning deaths? One lactose intolerant audience member in the room. Obviously, this is a correlation. It's not causality. There is actually, this is not, I'm not making this up. There's a strong correlation between ice cream consumption and drowning deaths. Of course, there's a causality here, which is called summertime, right? Both of them are highly correlated with summer behaviors. You drown more in the summer, you eat ice cream in the summer. And so you have to be very careful when you go and find these metrics and find these correlations to devise tests that allow you to understand whether or not they are causal. Because a correlated metric is 2 things that are related, but they may be dependent on something else. A causal metric is one thing, one independent variable, which can produce a change in another dependent variable. And a leading causal metric is a superpower. If you find the leading causal metric for a behavior you want in your company, you can grow it at will as long as you can change the causal factor. I already mentioned you're going to hate the term growth hacking by the end of this year. So growth hacking, demystified, is basically just find yourself a metric you'd like to change, number of engaged subscribers. Find all the things that correlate with that, test the bejesus out of them until you know which one of them is going to actually produce the change you want, has a causal relationship, and then spend all your time optimizing the causal factor. Everything else that growth hackers tell you is basically this, with a little creativity applied to one of the 4 boxes. That answer your question? I mean, I wish I could tell you which causal factor to go optimize, but that'd be great. So here's a couple of slides I pulled together for a client I was talking to that are interesting because they show you the kind of thinking that might work. If you are a nonprofit, a user who takes some sort of social action, i.e. they share something with Facebook, is 4 times more likely to donate something than someone who doesn't. Now, this study said 4 times more likely. I'd want to dig into that and go, is there a correlation or is it causal? But you could easily see how you'd test this stuff. And if you were able to test this and prove that causal factor, I am able to get people to donate more money if I approach them on a mobile platform and encourage them to socialize that thing, then I'm going to be popping up please shares all the time because it makes you more likely to do it, if that's the case. Social mobile users were 7 times more likely to donate than antisocial mobile users. So I'm immediately going to say, well, I should spend my money on social platforms across mobile channels. Maybe that influences my advertising budget. So this kind of analysis, when you then turn it into experimentation, becomes the tools for fueling your growth. In all these cases, I've talked about the metric or the behavior I want to have. One of the hardest things to know when you're running a startup is what metric or what behavior do you really want? So I'm going to ask you another question. Why is Nigerian spam so poorly written? I've always said that if Nigerian spammers just knew how to write proper English emails, we'd all be in trouble, right? Because we'd all click on them. But they always seem to look stupid. They have bad typos. They say, hello, I'm Nigerian royalty. They're always awkward, right? But if they got it right, we'd all be in trouble, correct? No. Studies show that Nigerian spammers know very well that they are writing bad emails. And the reason for this, and this is from a Microsoft study, experienced scammers expect a strike rate of 1 or 2 people per 1,000 that are going to do something. By sending an email that repels all but the most gullible, the scammer gets the most promising marks. So imagine you have 2 cases here. Here's the first case where I send 1,000 emails. I have horrible language, 0.1% conversion. I get 1 to 2 responses, but those people are very gullible, so I get a high 70% conversion, and I've parted one fool from their money. On the other hand, if I word it properly, I get 10% conversion. Now I have to deal with 100 people, 98 of whom are going to call the FTC or the Nigerian Royalty Police or whatever you call and get me in trouble, and I'm going to have to deal with them. I don't want to do that. So they know full well that this would be an incredibly inefficient use of their time. It turns out the word Nigeria in an email is an incredibly strong predictor of whether you're dumb enough to send your email to Nigeria. So it's very hard to understand this because we tend to cling to vanity metrics. Nigerian spammers really understand their true business goal, which is to get you to send money to Nigeria. It's not to get you to open an email. Opening an email sounds like a great metric. It's actually just a ruse. It's actually a mirage. You don't want to go after that. It actually hurts the business model. And so one of the hardest things for you to do as founders is understand the real behavior you want and work back from that in a disciplined, scientific way to the metrics you're tracking, whether they are just correlated or actually causing that, and then how you optimize them. So having thought about this sort of background in metrics and analytics, I want to give you a very quick look at what we call the lean analytics framework. Any questions so far? We're kind of rushing through stuff, and I'm telling you all kinds of lies. And anybody online want to yell at Ken? Okay. So let me tell you about the framework. So we spent a bunch of time trying to understand the common stages of growth that companies go through, because I would love to tell you there's one metric for you. The reality is there are many metrics depending on the stage of company you're at, the stage of growth you're at, and the kind of company you're in. So Eric Ries has these things called the 3 engines of growth. He says the first is stickiness, which is simply keep people coming back. And the math that matters in this case is, do I get customers faster than I lose them? The second engine of growth is virality. Can I make people invite their friends? And the metric that matters is how many people tell their friends and how fast they do it. And the third way to grow is your price. And by price, he means revenue, get people to spend some money, take some of that money and use it to acquire more customers. So the math that matters is, does it cost me less to acquire customers than I actually extract from them during their life with my company or organization? So we like this, so we stole that. There's a guy named Dave McClure who has a brilliant model for acquisition. something he calls pirate metrics. He says that there are 5 sets of metrics you want to track. There's acquisition, activation, retention, referral, and revenue. Because Dave is a funny guy, he realized that spells R, and so it's called pirate metrics. But Dave's a brilliant guy. He's a lousy artist. So we decided to redraw this as acquisition, which is how people find out about you. That's your usual SEO kind of stuff. Activation, which is like that drive-by visitor becomes engaged, tries you out, size up. Retention, which means once they've signed up, they actually come back over and over again. Revenue, which is I make money from them. And referral, which is them telling their friends. And so we kind of stole that too. And we said, okay, put these together. There's these 5 stages that everybody we talk to keeps saying they go through. And when they go through them in the right order, good things happen. And when they skip stuff prematurely, bad things happen. And they are empathy, which is understand what people want and what I can make and whether they'll use it. Stickiness, which is can I get a few people to like it? I saw the sign in the front door that says, focus on making 1,000 people happy, not 1 million. Why would you believe that 10 million people will use your product if you can't get 100 to use it repeatedly? So stickiness before scaling is very important. Virality, which is being able to get people to tell their friends in a fast, responsive way, reliably and naturally. The reason you do that now is because if I acquire a user and every user on average acquires me another half a user, then later on when I'm paying for acquisition, my dollar goes further because every user I acquire becomes 1.5 users. Later on, there's the revenue stage, which is I now take some money and spend some portion of that on acquisition. And finally, scaling, which is do I have good margins? Is my incremental order cost reasonably small? And so on. So I'm going to give you a few quick tips on those stages. First of all, the empathy stage. We ran a startup accelerator in Montreal called Year One Labs. It had 5 companies in it over a period of about 6 months. It was all focused on the first year of a company. Very hands-on, much earlier stage, more like an incubator. They came in with founders, but not necessarily an idea, and we'd work with them on that. One of the companies was called Local Mind, and Local Mind was acquired by Airbnb 2011. They allow you to ask questions of a location. So I could say, hey, Mountain View, where's a good place for Indian food? There's a big assumption in that. I mean, there's a few assumptions in the business model, but one of the big assumptions is people will answer questions from strangers. So one of the fundamental tenets of lean startup is to reduce the risk earlier in the life cycle of the company. In this case, we told the guys you're not allowed to code. They got on Twitter and they spent a day asking New York City, because we figured that's a pretty hostile, if you can get an answer there, you can get one anywhere. They asked geofenced tweets around Times Square for random questions. Where's the local toilet? Where's good Wi-Fi? Can you recommend a Chinese restaurant? Where's the subway? And they measured what percentage of people answered questions from a complete stranger. Turns out it was like 97%. That was more than enough for them to go, we've de-risked this assumption. There were many other assumptions they didn't de-risk. One of them was, will strangers ask questions? That was a harder problem to solve. But rather than writing code, which is everyone's default behavior, they'd gone out, they'd done a lot of interviews, they had an idea, and they found ways of testing those hypotheses as quickly as possible without writing a lot of code. So they had a metric. They said, look, if more than 90% of strangers answer a question, we're a go. If not, we got to rethink our business. They drew that line in the sand. They ran an experiment that gave them confidence that one of their assumptions was valid. This is the kind of metric you do and the kind of analytics you do in the empathy stage of the life cycle of a company. One of the big challenges when you're doing this kind of metrics, I mean, sure, there's the qualitative go out and talk to people, but you do some surveys. And one of the big challenges when you're doing this is trying to avoid leading the witness. So you want to do a number of things. One of them is you don't want to tip your hand. You want to really avoid biased wordings or preconceptions. So let's say I ask you this survey, and then the first one says, this book is awesome. Strongly disagree, strongly agree. The next one says, this book is terrible. Strongly disagree, strongly agree. The next one says, rate this book from bad, tolerable, meh, excellent, and absolutely amazing. And the bottom one says, rate this book from bad to good. You're going to get dramatically different responses from these. The fourth one is actually the one that's likely to give you the most accurate response. Even more accurate is to say, how many of your friends think this book is good? Show of hands right now, here and online and on the Hangout, how many people smoke pot? Okay, did you get any answers? Okay, now, show of hands in the room and online, how many people think that most of their friends smoke pot? So it turns out I'll get a much more honest answer. Nobody's going to do that one either. You get a much more honest answer if you say, 50% of my friends do X than I do X, because we think other people are just like us. 50% of Americans approve of this, they're more likely to give you an answer that reflects their own test. So there's a number of psychological tricks you can do to extract real information and overcome things like the biases people have where they want to help you understand stuff. Another problem here is making the question real. Get them to purchase, ask them to pay. You may give the thing away afterwards, but you put a thing in that says, click here to buy this thing. And then you don't charge them at the end, but they actually clicked it. You'll get a much more accurate understanding. Or here's a feature that you put in the product. When they click the button, it says, well, we haven't built this yet, but we were thinking of doing it. What did you think? What were you looking for? One of the greatest tricks I've ever heard, and you're welcome to steal this, is a company that was thinking of adding a new feature called reporting. So they put a tab in that said reporting. When you clicked on it, it said, hey, we're almost finished this feature. What did you hope was here? And they took all the data and they hired an intern or some other Flesh-based API and said, could you consolidate this stuff into one, they came up with like the top 10 reports. And guess what? They built those 10 reports as defaults. That's clever. What's brilliant is they then went and found the usernames. They mapped them to the report they'd asked for. They said, thanks to your response, we've decided to put this in. All those users got on Twitter. These guys are amazing. They built this report just for me. Hundreds of people were ecstatic that they were this unique and special snowflake around which the entire company was moving. That's good hacking, right? They surveyed people. They got the right things there. They followed the 80-20 rule of what are the 20% of reports that satisfy 80% of people. And then they put those 80% of people on a podium and made them feel like rock stars driving their product direction. I'm not telling you the name of the company, but I suspect you can do that fairly effectively. Sorry? I'm not telling you who it was. You can also ask them questions like how many of your friends would say, like I just did. You can ask why several times. I like to talk a lot. When I'm doing interviews, I leave awkward, uncomfortable pauses. I mean, we love to fill that space, right? It just feels wrong. So when you're interviewing, there's techniques like this. Ash Moira has a great book called Running Lean. It's part of the same series ours is in. But there are techniques like this, psychological techniques to get real answers. Ask why 5 times. The other thing is have a colleague. Never go to one of these interviews alone. Have someone next to you who's taking notes, noting body language, all that kind of stuff. When you're in the stickiness stage, a little past this, you found an idea, you think it's got approval. In stickiness, you really want to make sure you take everything out of the way that might not encourage adoption and reuse. So another company at Year One Labs is a company called Kidik. Questions done quick. And the basic idea here was I'm going to come up with a way to ask all of you a question. So let's say I got all your emails from Ken. I send you all an email. How many of you smoke pot? You get that email. You install a mobile app. The first thing you see when you log in with your email and the password you received is a question. You click on it, and then you see results. Well, that was their first build. And as you can see, there's a lot of stuff in the middle here. I send you the mail. The recipient gets an invite. They install it. And down here, that's pretty lousy, 10 to 25% conversion rate. So then they said, well, what can we rip out that's not the very core of our product? And of course, they realized that all this stuff in the middle about creating an account and installing an app was lousy. So they said, we're just going to add the recipient to a group. So I add you all. You get an email, and there's 2 links on it. Yes, I do. No, I don't. When you click on the link, your vote is tallied, and you see the results. And they said, but Alistair, when that happens, how on earth will those people have an account and be able to see questions they've answered and so on? I said, well, later on, if they need to, they can go to the website and it says, I'm sorry, you don't have a password. Everybody here knows how to do password recovery. We assume that by clicking on the vote, you said, yes, I want to be a part of this service. Now when you return, you type in your email, you do a password recovery, now you have a full-fledged account. Conversion rate went from 10 to 25% to 70 to 90%. With that one change, they're about to give it up. All of a sudden, they get amazing, but way better conversion rate on a vote than you ever see on any kind of survey. Best response rate I've ever had using an embedded Google Forms thing is 30%. I can reliably get an answer to a single question here, post the follow-up questions online, whatever. So in the stickiness phase, your goal is to find that core value, that virtuous loop they can't do without, and then optimize it by taking out all the other crap. One of the metrics people track for stickiness is called engagement. And here's a way of understanding engagement. You might say, in January, how many days has it been since our last engagement with a user? Let's say it's a visit or inviting a friend or sending a mail or whatever. I see the number of days since last engagement. It's the very washed out gray here. And then here's February, number of days since last engagement. This is a little harder to look at, but it's much more informative about whether I'm getting better or not at capturing users. I might also track how many people are disengaged. So, January versus February, I got slightly more users that haven't come back in the last 10 days. This kind of chart's really good because this tells me this is a really good thing. You had 400 users who'd come back in 1 day or less in January. In February, 800 users come back in 1 day or less. So when you're talking about engagement, you can't just say like days since last visit. You got to compare it in this kind of sophisticated way, usually histograms. Understanding engagement is really tricky. I'm going to show you 2 users. So here's a user, and over their lifetime, they have spent $200. This horizontal line is time, right? Each one of these is a visit. So this guy's visited 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times. Here's a second user. Oh, and this is today, by the way, on my time horizon. Here's a second user, and they've visited 4 times. Also spent a lifetime value of $200. Which one of these 2 users is more valuable to the company? User A. Anybody else? User B. It's hard to tell, right? So here's the key. I don't care about how much money you've brought me so far. I care about your residual lifetime value, the amount of money you will generate from now till the future, because the past's already in my bank account. What are the chances that user A has gone dark and forgotten about me forever? Like, they're coming pretty, like, statistically, there's a big gap here, right? They were visiting, and then they stopped. What are the chances that user B has just gone on vacation? A little higher, right? They were irregular. The gap between here and here is pretty small. Like, it's not much longer than the gap between any one of these visits. So if you're doing the math on residual lifetime value, this is a study that Roberto Medri did at Etsy. If you're doing the math on residual lifetime value, you have to predict not only how much money they've spent, but also the likelihood that you are dead to them forever. And that is a factor not just of how long it's been, but how often they used to visit, the frequency of their visits compared to their current lack of being there. Math behind customer lifetime value is actually pretty complex. So measuring engagement is tricky. All right, let's move on to the next stage, virality. Virality focuses on things like content sharing. There are 2 kinds of virality. There's inherent virality, kind of like a Dropbox, where I have to, in order to use the tool somehow, or a Skype, in order to use the tool, I'm inviting someone else. And then there's artificial virality, which is like Dropbox's promotional stuff, where they say, click here and we'll give you some free storage and someone else some free storage. There's lots of ways to encourage this. As it turns out, what's called viral coefficient, which is the number of people you will invite, it's a multiplier on your own visit or invite, is actually not the only problem you have to calculate. The most common example of viral marketing is the Hotmail tagline. Every single message you sent out included this link. People clicked on that link, right? So you can, and by the way, virality is not that new. There's a thing called the Bass diffusion curve from the 1960s. But if you look at the predictions of things like the Bass diffusion curve and market saturation and market penetration against what Hotmail saw in growth, they map almost exactly. So if you're a stats geek or a math geek, you can use this to calculate viral coefficient. I prefer this one, which is users times viral coefficient minus the churn is greater than 1. So the way you calculate viral coefficient is this. You first calculate the invitation rate, which is the number of invites that you sent out divided by the number of users you have. And then you calculate the acceptance rate, which is how many of those people actually accepted something, and you multiply the 2 together. So here's an example. I got 2,000 customers. They sent out 5,000 invitations during their lifetime on my site. So my invitation rate is 2.5. For every 10 invitations, 1 gets clicked. My acceptance rate is 0.1. You multiply those 2% together, and you get 0.25. That tells me for every customer I acquire, I will acquire 1/4 extra customer. And yes, that person will acquire another quarter customer and another quarter customer, but you're being pedantic. Just calculate the first one. It's easy enough. Very important to note that viral coefficient is not the most important thing. Has anybody here ever heard of Tableau? T-A-B-B-L-O? Not the visualization company. T-A-B-B-L-O. So I'd show you their logo, but I couldn't find it on image search, which is a sign that you lost on the internet. They were acquired by HP. At the time that YouTube was around, there were several video streaming sites. One was called YouTube. We still hear that name. One was called Tableau. It had a higher viral coefficient than YouTube, but it had a much longer viral cycle time. YouTube, you saw something, you shared it right away. Tableau, you saw something, you were more likely to share it over a long period of time, but it took you like days and days to actually share it. Anybody who understands compound interest knows that it's not just about the percentage, but also about the compounding interval. So when you're calculating virality, you actually need to track not just the virality, but also the cycle time. Optimize how long until someone shares as well as the viral cycle, as well as the viral coefficient. When you move on to the revenue stage of a company, this is where you're trying to spend money acquiring people, hopefully for less than they pay you. This is a company called Backupify that I looked at. They initially focused on how many site visitors. Then they focused on how many of those visitors tried something out. Then they switched to how many of the trial users signed up. Today they're focused on the monthly recurring revenue because they're very business focused. In early 2010, their customer acquisition cost was $243. Their average revenue per user was $39. This is not a good thing. They changed to target business users. Today, their customer lifetime value to customer acquisition cost is 5 to 6 times. And the metric they run to track this today is what they call customer acquisition payback. How many months does it take me to pay back the cost of acquiring a customer? That's a really good metric in the revenue stage. Here's how you calculate it. If I have 25% monthly churn, right? So if I take 100 divided by 25, that means that on average, a customer sticks around for 4 months, right? If I have 25% churn, I lose 25% of my customers a month. Then it follows that I have the average customer for 4 months, that makes sense? Or the customer lifetime value for 4 months. So I now have their customer lifetime value to me, or at least the lifetime that they'll have. A 5% monthly churn, I got 20 months. 2% monthly churn, I got 50 months. Everybody understand that part? So, sorry, I'll come back to the rest later. So basically, when you're calculating how long until a customer sticks around, until a customer leaves, you want to figure out the customer lifespan. Then you can figure out what they spend during that lifespan, and you can use that to measure their total value. And then in the scale stage, you care about many more common business metrics. In the scale stage, you've kind of moved beyond the traditional product market fit of a startup. Now you're at the phase where you're trying to understand things like incremental order quantity. Am I scaling my processes properly? What's the cost of deployment and integration? How many trouble tickets am I having? All these other metrics. And you may say we're really understaffed. Your metrics are going to be things like time until a new hire is productive, or percentage of resumes that I'm seeing which pass my first test. So that may be the metric you care about that week. So we looked at the stages. Ben and I also went through and we said, look, we can't boil the ocean, but let's at least try and narrow it down to a few business model archetypes. And those business models might be things like e-commerce, two-sided marketplaces, software as a service, mobile apps, user-generated content, and media. Each of these is sort of one business model, right? So the media business model is I get visitors who look at stuff, some of them click on ads. The two-sided marketplace is I have people who list things and people who buy things. Hopefully they come together and I take a cut. There's some very fundamental business models. And even if you're someone like an Amazon, you have 2 or 3 of these that make up your business. You have an e-commerce shopping cart. You have user-generated content in the form of reviews, and so on. So you have some fundamentals like this. And then, and I'm not going to bore you with reading this through, but it means that you get eye charts that look kind of like this. They're all in the book, where you start to say, hey, I got customer acquisitions. They go through some kind of trial. They're engaged. Either they become disengaged or become paying customers. They stick around until they either run out of money, get dissatisfied, lose utility. Some of them upsell. But you wind up drawing a box like this. And for all of your businesses, if there's one thing I would encourage you to go home and do with your team the next time you have some kind of offsite, it's sit down and draw this kind of flow chart of the customer life cycle. Because you'll notice that for this, I've got like, what's my reactivation rate? What's my trial abandonment rate? What's my user lifetime value? What's my paid churn rate? What's my viral coefficient? If you can't draw your business as a fairly simple, and by fairly simple, I mean like no less than 12-point font, kind of diagram like this, you probably don't understand it in a fundamental enough way. Once you do, you can start instrumenting it and you can see what's flaming red. This is a visualization of the spreadsheet you have sold an investor. You need to quantify it, you need to draw it out, agree on it, and then start measuring it. In my experience, this is one of the most useful activities for startups to undertake. So we realized the business model you're in, plus the metric of the stage that you're at, gives you one metric which should matter to you a lot. We call that the one metric that matters. And people say, Alistair, you're insane. One metric? And I say, yes, just one. Because in a startup, focus is really, really hard to achieve. That's actually one of the most precious commodities you have. You have limited time. It's very easy to get distracted by thousands of things, so focus is the thing you need to achieve. Having one metric really addresses this problem. When you're driving your car, you have hundreds of metrics you could check. You have battery life, and you have oil pressure, and you have gas, and you have RPMs, and you have the vibration of the engine, and all sorts of other metrics, right? When you're backing up a car and parking it, what's the most important metric? What's the one metric that matters? Distance from the vehicle behind you. So I'm not saying these other metrics don't matter. I'm saying manage them by exception. If you're trying to park your car and the oil pressure light comes on, you're going to have to restart the car. But for the most part, there is one metric that matters for the task at hand. And if you are a good founder, you will understand what that metric is and you will drive your team to getting that metric to the right line in the sand before moving on. SEO Moz, now called Moz, had a problem. When Brad Feld came in as an investor, he said, look guys, you've got way too many metrics, please cut down on them. They were focused on what they call net adds. And the way they count net adds is they look at how many users did we add, net adds, which is new users minus churn. If net adds is up, they ask themselves, was it a marketing campaign that worked? Were customer complaints reduced somehow? Was a product upgrade valuable to people? If they're flat, hey, how can we fix these things? Can we improve support? What features would increase engagement? And if they're down, are we not targeting customers on the right segment so they all went away? Did a marketing campaign fail somehow? Did a product upgrade not work? Is customer support not handling trouble tickets well? But this is the thing they drive the business by, net adds. They have a nice clean view. That's the number the board cares about. I like the one metric rule because metrics are like squeeze toys. If you're optimizing for a number of people on your site, and once you've got that across that line in the sand that you need it to be for your business model, you will immediately optimize the next metric. The next metric might be number of people who try the service. Just like we saw in that earlier example from Backupify, they move through a logical series of these things, moving from empathy all the way down to scale. So I could sit here and show you an eye chart that looked like this that says, hey, these are the metrics you want for different business models across here, and there's detailed stuff behind this. I'm going to save you time. This is a URL to a PDF that we created that has the grid of the 5 stages and the 6 business models with a couple of paragraphs about the metrics you probably care about for that stage. So go to bit.ly/bigleantable, capital B, capital L, capital T, and you'll get a PDF that has a much easier to read version of this you can take home and ponder with a glass of wine. Any questions?
We have one question on the live stream, and then I'll come to questions in the room. Seems like it's kind of a psychology question. So what is your advice for getting the team to stop focusing on vanity metrics, especially the ones that might look best to the public or customers? That's
a very good problem. So a vanity metric is something that makes you feel good but doesn't change your behavior. I used to say vanity metrics are bad, you're all idiots, how dare you? I've become a little more jaded, a little less jaded, I would say. Most vanity metrics are tied to a real business metric. Site traffic, for example, number of visits is a vanity metric. Number of followers is a vanity metric. But it is tied to something, right? I don't want followers, I want minions, people who will do my bidding. So what you do is you go, it's great to celebrate the number of followers we have. Now, let's instrument the funnel to understand what percentage of those followers, good job with the followers, by the way. Did I mention that followers are awesome? Will do the thing you want. What thing do they want to do? Oh, here's our funnel. Or you go, hey, it's great that we've got all this stuff on the site traffic because now we can move on to the next challenge. So look at the vanity metric as that's great, we've accomplished it. Why is it important to the business model? None of this works if you don't have a spreadsheet that is your business assumption. I always hate people saying, show me a business plan. Because if you're doing it right, a business plan is just your business model, but you've selected the row on the left and you've dragged it to the right. And it just sort of fills in and calculates, right? What's over on the left, the assumptions, is what matters. And so if you've got a thing that says, we'll have 1 million visitors, of whom 100,000 try it out, of whom 5,000 buy, of whom 3,000 pay their bills, of whom 1,000 stick around, and someone goes, yay, we made 1 million visitors, you have to celebrate that because it's good for morale, and sometimes it's important for dumb investors and stuff like that too, or the press, other things. But I didn't say all investors are dumb, I said it's good for dumb investors. But you need to educate more on the funnel that leads from the vanity metric. So use the vanity metric as the first step in a journey and say, that's great, our business model wants this outcome, how are they tied together? The challenge is when the vanity metric is actually poisonous. So in the Nigerian spam example, open rate is actually a bad thing. Open rate by people who are dumb enough to send money to Nigeria is a good thing. So when the vanity metric is the first step of a funnel, it's easy. When the vanity metric is not, that's when you tend to get to loggerheads, where the vanity metric is actually a bad indicator. You need to sit down and prove to them, look, when this happens, it costs us too much, we should do this instead.
This is a much more tactical question, I guess, but we've talked a lot about sort of disengaged users who've left the service. So for a subscription model, it's pretty clear when they stop paying you, they've left the service. For just regular users who aren't paying, they might come back at some future point. What methods have you used to determine like a cutoff for when someone has left the service?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I tend to like the idea of the person's left the service when they stop deriving utility from the service. So ask yourself what utility it offers. So for example, in Flickr, if I have a bunch of photos there, I've left the service when I stop uploading, but I may actually still enjoy it because other people are coming to look at my photos. So it's hard you have to measure what's the utility derived by the user. You probably have different tiers of users. So in that case, I would have, for Flickr, I might say users for Picasa, I might say users that are using it to showcase their stuff versus users who are using it to store their stuff versus users who are using it to edit their stuff. And so I might have, he is a disengaged editor, but still an engaged uploader. She is an engaged showcaser or gallery owner. And so what you can do is find the kinds of utility and then measure the engagement of those different groups. And you may realize that the only people that pay you money are those who use the editing tools. So the other ones are nice to haves, but you need to focus on. So segment within the levels of utility people derive from the product and use that. Yes?
Yeah, I just had a quick question about that taxonomy that you had of the different business models. Where would you place some of these new hybrid models that are coming out, which are like between a marketplace and a services business, like last mile delivery, on-demand food, clothing rentals? Where would that?
So we spend a lot of time trying to figure out the right number, very much in that Einsteinian as simple as possible, but no simpler thing. And we came up with those 6 because we were unable to find a way of reducing them to less.
Right.
But we were also unable to find an example of someone who didn't want to be a unique and special snowflake, but were in fact 2 of them. Just as you said, they're a hybrid. That means you have 2 sets of business goals. Maybe for Amazon you have, I want people to write reviews and I want them to buy books. So you have 2 business models. You're going to decide this week we're going to fix user engagement. This week we're going to fix conversion rate. Treat it like e-commerce. Treat it like user-generated content. I have not, and I'm happy to have this discussion with you one-on-one, I have not found someone who, I've had people go, no, we're B to C to B, but with a SaaS twist and a double backflip of, a triple Lutz of e-commerce. And I'm like, no, you're not a unique and special snowflake. Most of the fundamental models of business, even within that, there's a classification, which I didn't go into, which is 2-sided marketplaces in e-commerce are about the sale of goods. Media and user-generated content are about convincing people to be engaged and then click on something or do something. Even Reddit has ads, right? Even Wikipedia wants donations. And then the software as a service and mobile apps are the same. They want you to use a thing on a regular basis. So they care a lot about churn, they care a lot about conversion rate, and they care a lot about engagement and click-throughs. Those are, if you can show me a genuinely new way of making money, then I might entertain that there's a genuinely new way of a new business model. But every business model I have seen so far, the answer is break your business model into the fundamental behaviors you want, and each of them will fall into one of those 6.
That's helpful. Thanks.
So let's talk about drawing a line in the sand. I've told you how to collect metrics. I've told you not to move on until you're good enough. What's that line in the sand look like? So I'm going to ask you about a company that is losing a quarter of its customers every year. Is this company doing well or badly? It's a SaaS company, software as a service. They lose a quarter of their customers a year. How many people think the company is doing well? How many people think the company is doing badly? None of you trust me anymore, which is good. That shows you're being skeptical and circumspect, and that's important for an analytical mind. It turns out this is really good. We talked to a company called WP Engine. They're a web hosting company. Their founder was killing themselves trying to get below 2% churn a month. 2% of your customers leaving a month. He was killing himself. Turns out Salesforce gets like 1.6. And they have a team of PhDs on it. People tend to leave. 2% a month means you got them for 4 years. Take as much money as you can for 4 years. But if you don't know that 2% a month is good, you're going to continue optimizing to the point of very diminished returns. When instead what you should be doing is going, I want to work on lowering my customer acquisition cost or increasing my virality. So when you know what the right number is, you can make good decisions. And I'm going to talk about a few of these things. We spent a lot of time, a lot of that book, the middle part of that book is what's normal. And I think that's why it's been useful, is that nobody really gone out and drawn a line in the sand. So here are some examples of what's normal so you don't go out and do stupid things. what level of growth should you have? We talked to a few people. Paul Graham is of the opinion that you should be growing your user count by 5% before your revenue. And then once you've got revenue, you should be growing revenues by 5% a week. If you're in Y Combinator and you're not growing either your user count or your revenues by 5% a week, you are considered doing too slowly. And there's a reason for that, right? A startup is an organization designed to search for a sustainable, repeatable business model under conditions of extreme uncertainty and rapid growth. You may be growing your hair salon more slowly than that. You're not a startup. The business model of cutting hair and charging people for it is well established. So because you are searching for a new business model, a new way of doing something in an environment of high uncertainty that requires growth. One of the reasons that we are so tied to technology, why startups tend to be tech companies, is that the only thing that can really sustain that kind of growth tends to be technology. You look at Groupon, yeah, they were a tech company, but there was a lot of meat in that technology. There were a lot of people pounding the streets and knocking on doors. And because of that, it was very hard to scale that portion of the business. So there's a strong bias towards tech because tech allows rate of sustained rapid growth. What is normal user engagement? Fred Wilson, who's written a lot about this, says that you are going to see roughly 10% user engagement a day. If you have a mobile app or a social app or a web app, 30% of your total users per month use the web or mobile app. So if you have 100 users, 30% of them, 30 will use that web or mobile app. The rest have kind of forgotten about you or they don't come back. Within those, 10% of them use it a day. And within those, 1% of your users are using it concurrently. This is web and social and mobile apps, so it's not the case where you go and buy a wedding dress and leave, right? We're talking about things where someone comes back repeatedly. But this is a good baseline. This may not be your business. One of the numbers I heard, which I didn't include in here, is that the average, and this sounds like a made-up number, the average amount of time on site per social app is 17 minutes. 17 sounds like a made-up number. We like it. It's a prime number. For some reason, we think that people are lying when they use even numbers. But 17 minutes seems to be the amount of time, on average, that people spend on a social site. The big exception is Facebook, which is about 60 minutes a day. We spend 60 minutes a day on Facebook. I once calculated the number of people's lives that go by every day on Facebook. Just in human hours, it's really depressing. Or heartening, depending on whether you feel like you're connected to people on Facebook. So there are some basic lines. You will be different from these, but the point is measure it and then find out if you're weird. Because if you're really weird, good weird, that's important. If you're really weird, bad weird, maybe you can learn from others. I talked earlier about is 2% good. Your baseline churn should be below 5% a month before you move on to other stuff. You know you're going to get the kinks worked out, but if you can't get 95% of your customers on January to come back in February, you probably need to work on that before you do other stuff. You shouldn't be throwing money at it. If your customers won't stick around, why are you going to acquire them? To really grow, you need to get below 2% a month. And last ditch appeals, like, have you ever tried to leave Facebook? Anybody ever tried to leave Facebook? Just try it, it's fun. It says like, Alistair will really miss you. And they like Photoshop tears in my eyes. It reduces churn by 7%. We talked earlier about customer acquisition cost, right? So I think, and many people tend to agree, that your customer acquisition cost should be a third of what you expect to recoup from that customer in their lifetime. The reason is you're probably optimistic about your customer's lifetime value and you're probably conservative about the cost of acquiring that customer. Time kills all your plans, so if you are wrong, well, it turns out you'll wait like 6 months before you know you were wrong and then you've spent all your money. And the idea behind this customer lifetime value, customer acquisition cost is you're loaning the customer money. You're saying you're going to make me money in 24 months' time. Let me loan you my service for 24 months while I finish, now that I've acquired you, before I pay it back. So that's a lousy thing. But the math is like this. If I know you have a customer lifespan of 20 months, and I showed you how to calculate that earlier, and I'm charging you $30 per month per customer, that means I'm getting $600 customer lifetime value. Math makes sense, everybody? So based on that, I know I should spend no more than a third. My budget for acquiring a customer is $200. Makes sense. The smartest thing you can do at this point is segment those users. Find out, is there something about your users that makes them more valuable? And then you can afford to spend more on that set of users. So is it which channel they come in from, what it is about their income, their gender, their nationality, whatever, and use that to segment so you know I can afford to spend $500 on people from Canada, but only $7 on people who live in Florida. Little plug for Canada there. Some other metrics. This is from a study that Flurry did, and there's a lot of, I'm just throwing a few of these examples as baselines. mobile users, on your first day, obviously 100% of people use it. By day 30, 54%, then 43%. By day 90, you'll find that roughly 35% of your people are still using some kind of mobile app. In recent years, third month engagement has increased. So it used to be 25%, it's 35%, but frequency of use has dropped a lot. So there are these studies, right, that show that in a smartphone case, you'll use something on your smartphone roughly 13 times, but you'll only use it for 4 minutes. Whereas on a tablet, you use it 9.5 times, but you use it for 8 minutes. If you didn't know this, I mean, this data is who cares? Unless you're, right now this week, your metric that matters is mobile app engagement, in which case this is the most important slide in the world because it's your baseline. Once you know that, you can start testing up tests and optimizing for it. And a caveat here, this varies widely by product. Retention over 90 days, frequency of use per week depends heavily. So communication apps are in the top right, that's nice. Down here, things like music and personalization. There's some tools like food and drink, which you use very seldom, but you keep using them, so you need to know which group you're in. This is a study by Flurry, same study that did this stuff. And it's in the book, so if you want to find it, you're in the mobile app, it's in the mobile app section. So how do you put all this stuff to work? Well, we have something we call the lean analytics cycle. And I'm warning you, for many of you, you'll go, wow, Alistair, thanks for showing us science. But for some reason, this is like the most popular slide we've ever presented in blogs. It's the thing people think is magical. So you pick some kind of metric or KPI and you draw a line in the sand. I want churn to get below 2%, whatever. You find a potential improvement, something you think will work. Either you woke up and said, I got a good guess for this, or it's something that you find in the data. Hey, we noticed that people who come from Florida spend more money. You come up with a hypothesis. You make changes to the system in production if you're lean and agile, or you design some kind of test if you don't have access to the full system, and you measure the results. Did they do what we hoped? At this point, you say, did we move the needle? And yes, this is called science. So let's just remember, this is kind of stating the obvious, but it's important to apply it. One possibility is that you succeeded. You changed all the buttons to pink and conversion went up 300%, you're done. Another possibility is that you did not succeed and you have no more ideas and you either need to give up, give all the money back to your investors, or you need to pivot and change your business model fundamentally. Another possibility is that you draw a new line in the sand. That sounds kind of cheating, right? And it's like, oh, I'm going to get conversion to 5%. Well, we didn't do 3. Okay, the new goal is 3%. Yay, we scored. There's only one way you're allowed to change the line in the sand, and that's if you have some informed learning. So one of the companies in Year One Labs was called High Score House. They built an app that let parents manage chores with their kids. Each day the parent would sit down with the kid and say, these are the chores, did you do them? And they'd reward them. So their metric for engagement was what percentage of users use the app every day. They were doing horribly. And they were about to give up, and then the founder, Kyle, called a few of their customers. And the customers almost universally said, we love your app, we use it every week. And he went, what? I said, yeah, on Saturday we sit down and we plan the chores. What? Yeah, we sit down on Saturday. It's kind of hard to use because you have to go through each of the days, but we do it. That's an informed piece of learning. He was able to move the line to once a week because now he'd had informed feedback from his customer that allowed him to change the product and make it a weekly product and all this other stuff, right? So you can move the line in the sand if your customer gives you permission to move it by telling you something new about their business. And finally, there's try again. You may be running these experiments all the time, so you're constantly doing this stuff. Now, this happens and it has huge impact. Airbnb, for example. When Airbnb had this hypothesis about photography, they said, we think that professional photography dramatically improves the revenues and the fortunes of people who list on Airbnb. Well, what are we going to do to try that out? They said, we're going to create what's called a concierge MVP. You know what a minimum viable product is, or an MVP? It's the least you need to do to validate or repudiate an assumption. A curated one is, we're just going to it's like the Wizard of Oz approach, right? There's something behind the curtains, it looks real, but it's not. So in this case, there was a button you could buy, you could pay to have them photograph your property, and then someone at Airbnb would scramble on a phone to find a photographer and say, please pretend you're from Airbnb, get a nicer haircut, go over there, be friendly, and then take pictures, right? They didn't actually hire people. They measured the results. It turns out that people who had professionally photographed properties were 2 to 3 times, they had 2 to 3 times more rentals. Huge. This is actually the point in the graph where you see the hockey stick in the fortunes of Airbnb. It's where they pull away from VRBO and others. By February 2012, they were doing 5,000 photo shoots a month. It's a big business, 20 full-time employees just taking pictures. So if you've been listening, and by now you don't trust me because you shouldn't, you'll say, hang on a second, Alistair, you're lying to us. Because that part that said, hey, there's this gut instinct hypothesis, someone in the shower went, maybe photos are good, that could happen, but maybe there's data. This part of the diagram here where I said, without data or with data, that's the really interesting part. Because without data would be like, hey, those houses that really do look nice, and they've all got like photographs, maybe it's the camera. Let's test. But in a magical Star Trek world, or I think probably this is Google in 2 years, you'll go, hey, computer, what do all the highly rented houses have in common? And the computer would leaf through all that EXIF data and say, camera model, and you'd have your answer. The reality is that in many cases, you don't actually have to come up with a gut hypothesis and iterate on it. It's enough to look at the data and find patterns. Let me give you a concrete example of that. This is a company called Circle of Moms. They were actually called Circle of Friends. Circle of Friends allowed you to do Facebook groups before Facebook had groups. They had about 10 million users. And one horrible problem, which is that almost nobody used the product. People would go in and they'd create the thing. Only 20% of people who created a group would ever go in and use it. And even when they did, nothing happened. You try and invite people, get a discussion going, nothing, right? The founders are pretty fed up. They're ready to leave. And they said, look, let's go, before we give up, let's go look at the data and see if there are patterns of engagement and what do those people have in common. Turns out they were all mothers. By looking at the data, they found that moms, their messages were longer, they were more likely to attach a post, engage in a threaded conversation, more likely to engage with their friends, accept an invite, invite others, click on Facebook newsfeed items. So they changed their name of their company. They went from 10 million users to 500,000 users. They changed the name of the company to Circle of Moms. They grew back up to 4 million very engaged users and sold the company to Sugar. So in this case, they went around that lean analytics cycle, but they looked at the fork in the cycle that said, do I have data? And they mined the data for a commonality rather than waking up one morning and going, hey, maybe moms are our new target market. Most of the decisions people make are of that kind. When you think like this, you see it everywhere. When I said earlier that tech companies tend to be startups, I kind of lied because everyone is a tech company. So I'm going to use an example from a friend of mine who runs a restaurant. Now, it's a bit of a gimme because he used to be the general manager of Teradata, so he's a little biased towards data, but he's still running a restaurant. The reality is that in all businesses, the cost of running experiments is way down and the cost of getting people's attention is way up. And so most innovation happens as a result of those two factors. Most of the disruption you see, most of the reasons that enterprises are adopting lean-like models is these two things. Randy's restaurant called Solare down in San Diego, I was down there with him and his son, Tommy, who runs the bar, goes, hey dad, 24, and Randy goes, good. And I'm like, you guys are speaking in code. What does that mean? He says, well, we measure every day the cost of the staff that we had on, and we divide that by the total take for the night. If it's over 30%, things are bad. We spent too much on staff. If it's below 20%, maybe we underserved the customers, maybe we should have had more people on. If it's at around 24, 25%, that's just about perfect. So one metric that he uses to track the health of the company and sort of manages by exception is that. But if he knows halfway through the evening that things are trending badly, he can tell people to push the wine a little more, push the higher margin deals, that kind of thing. He also has a leading indicator he's found. And this isn't true for just his restaurant. This is it's different for the McDonald's versus the Fat Duck. But if the number of covers, meaning the number of people he will seat that night, is roughly 5 times the number of reservations he's got at 5 p.m. This is a leading indicator. He doesn't know if it's causal. Randy could, in theory, run a bunch of tests to find out if he gets more reservations, will it drive up total attendance? It might. I mean, maybe if there's more people sitting down at 5 p.m. or something, maybe more people see it and come by. But when you start looking for these lean approaches in non-tech companies, you see them everywhere. A food truck is the perfect minimum viable product for a restaurant. You can try out different products, you can try out different neighborhoods until you get things just right. It makes you start to wonder about things like, is the tip amount that people leave a leading indicator of long-term revenue for the restaurant? And yet not a lot of restaurateurs look at that. It makes you ask questions like, why are we giving every table the same menu? I mean, the first thing a restaurateur does is they get their menu and they laminate it and they make it look really nice, right? Shouldn't you be doing things with like the specials in different positions by different tables? I'm not saying one table gets steak and the other one gets tofu. I'm saying, why not organize things with different colors or whatever and run those as experiments? I was in a restaurant in an airport in Michigan, I think, And the waitress wrote, thanks, the amount, and then brandy, little eye, heart on the eye, and a purple pen. And I'm like, because I'm an analytics geek, I think, I wonder if I tip more for purple pens. What if green causes me to tip more than purple? How would you know that? Think about, as an organization, what you would need to set up to allow an empowered employee to go, I'm going to test pen color. You need to set up something on the point of sale terminal that says, randomly, give this person purple or give this person green, because otherwise Brandy might decide that she's going to give green ink to people with kids and purple ink to people who are dining by themselves and so on, right? So you got to have some kind of controlled system. You got to have a way of collecting that data at the edge, rolling it up into the center of the organization, and then making statistically significant decisions, and then carrying out and pushing back down that change to the organization. But an improvement of 1 or 2% in tipping could change the fortunes of a restaurant. So most large organizations are not thinking about how to implement this kind of analytics. And I think for many startups, there's a lot of room for disruption and improvement of business simply by allowing this stuff to happen. And of course, you can find other ways to experiment. This is a coffee shop near my house, but you could see easily that you could use other tools to get very quick data from your market. Now, I want to talk a little about the dangers of over-optimization. I've told you how awesome metrics are and continuous improvement and optimization. This is a horribly dangerous thing. And I'll tell you why. Why isn't Blockbuster Netflix? I mean, Blockbuster had a lot going for it, right? Blockbuster had plenty of inventory. They had all the movies out there. They had so much clout in Hollywood, they were able to get Hollywood to change the movies to align with their particular political goals. They also had market intelligence. Right? They had all their customers, all your existing payment information, all your history of what you'd rented. But the problem was Blockbuster didn't frame the problem well. They thought we're in the video store rental business, video movie rental business. They didn't think we're in the entertainment delivery business. Netflix realized it was in the entertainment delivery business and got there quickly. Netflix also had a problem with the business model because, Blockbuster, because Blockbuster was using late fees as a significant portion of their revenues. What are the late fees on Netflix? There aren't any. So if you go into it with those lenses, framing the problem from their point of view, something that got rid of late fees looked awful. And so optimization, over-optimization towards the obvious thing right in front of you tends to lead to incrementalism and mediocrity. This is a concept in math called the local maximum. You might be down here, and if you just follow optimization, you will get to the best possible world you're in today. I talked to Gail Ennis, who is the CMO for Omniture. She said, Alistair, you know what the problem with optimization is? Because they have all these tools that show images and stuff and optimize for page layout. She said, the single best thing you can do for click-through is big-breasted women. It is the number one cause of click-through, or cause. It's the number one correlating factor for click-through when you do any kind of try random images. But that undermines the brand integrity. It sends a really bad message. It may alienate people. That one click might go up, but the overall business model is not good. If you optimize for the local maximum, you miss a global maximum. And so if you are just playing the game by the existing rules using metrics, you're going to optimize to here. On the other hand, if you're innovating, if you're redefining the market, you're coming along and you're looking at video delivery or public transport or whatever, and you're redefining it with a new set of rules. I was talking to someone about Uber today. Uber's neat. When you use it, you think taxis are the stupidest thing in the world. Why would I ever do this again? But Uber takes advantage of a major change in the rules. Uber owes all of its allegiance, actually to Google Maps. Because in the old days, to be a taxi driver in London, you needed the knowledge. Literally, you needed to know the streets of London. Today, anyone can navigate the streets of London with Google Maps. All of a sudden, that democratizes, it reduces a barrier to entry, it democratizes the driving of a taxi or a car and allows Uber to flourish. So Uber actually owes its allegiance to the new rules that were created by ubiquitous, real-time updated, free mapping. So most of the innovations you see, here's taxi cab companies optimizing the world, along comes ubiquitous mapping and prosthetic knowledge of a city's streets, there's a new global maximum. Of course, the challenge for this is that short-term investors hate going downhill. And this is why many of you as startups are able to run laps around the big guys because they hate the short-term downhill that it requires to get to this new thing. In many cases, innovation is quite literally a leap of faith. You have no proof that that will be the place to go. You are jumping there. That's why it's called venture. Just be really sure you measure that leap carefully. I saw a quote, and I may be paraphrasing it, about Dropbox. One of the investors said, fortunately, these guys were too dumb to know it had been done before. Now, most of the time when we talk about cases like this, we're talking about things like Netflix and Blockbuster. The horse has already left the barn. It's obvious that an Uber or a Netflix is an improvement. I've been talking to a lot of large companies recently about how they're implementing innovation. And this story kind of makes me choke up all the time. I told it to some folks at Code for America earlier today, and I was like all emotional. So the insurance business is not exciting, right? The biggest, most emotional reaction most of you have had to insurance businesses is when Gilbert Gottfried lost the Aflac contract. Insurance companies are in the business of paying after you die, right? So I'm talking to life insurance companies. Life insurance companies like MetLife are in the business of paying after you've died. If you have an emotional reaction to it, it's probably not a very good one. There's a guy named Gary Hoberman, he's the CIO at MetLife, who's in the business of trying to reframe what insurance companies do. And I talked to him and he said, we have this project, we call it Project Infinity. He said, we've realized, and he told me about this and I kind of played it back to him, he goes, yeah, it's basically, they've realized that insurance companies, life insurance companies, can reframe themselves from I pay out when you die to I am the curator of your of your legacy beyond your death. Let me show you what that means. For 50 grand, maybe a little more, Gary's team built this. It's called Infinity. It's on the App Store. Here's a little app for Pop's 60th birthday. Let's have a look at the feed. Our favorite holiday, our first time away as a family. A video message for my wife saying goodbye to you, my love. My banking information, all my personal accounts and passwords. And I saw this. First of all, I was like, wow, this is the first time I felt like emotional. This is the last thing I leave behind. This is my life. You're going to curate that for me. And then I went, wait a minute, maybe I am okay with that. Maybe that is what an insurance company should be. Maybe they should stop being the company that pays out and be the curator of my legacy. That's kind of cool. Maybe you're the right, I kind of trusted you with everything. Yeah, I buy that. That's an adjacent market you can credibly claim. He's reframing the insurance industry from I pay out after you die to I am the curator of your legacy after your death. And I was like, wow, I'm like, that's kind of a message to my wife after my death. So a lot of times when companies actually sit down and reframe this stuff, they can do so for a fairly small amount of money, right? This is an easy thing for them to test out, see if it works. It doesn't cost them a lot. It probably costs less than the consultancy would have hired to write a report about it. And this is where these kind of lean models of do something simple, figuring out what you're doing, are really important. And I think this is where the lean stuff is going to apply really well to a lot of other organizations, not just startups. But it's this mentality of constant experimentation and small ideas. How you get there may be more important than where you're going. I used to spend a lot of time talking to startups and asking them, how do you build your product? How do you build your technology? Can you do it? How much do you charge? I spend a lot more time talking about baby steps right now. I spoke about Netflix earlier. People seem to forget that Netflix was a ship by postal service system. This was a great baby step, right? Because broadband wasn't available yet in reliable ways. And so most people could only get Netflix by the post. Turns out this was a great way to build customer lists and find out problems. It was a really good baby step. Clearly, they didn't call this postal fix. I mean, this was Netflix from the start. They knew it was going to be networking. This was just a hack to get around the lack of broadband. The Tesla. First Tesla that came out, people derided Elon Musk for building a sports car. Like, the world needs more fancy sports cars. He wrote a blog post that said, the first thing we're going to build a sports car is a sports car because it's the only way to test out the platform. By our third car, it will be a car for the masses. They knew the sports car was a baby step. Twitter. Everybody remember why Twitter is 140 characters? It's because SMS is 160 characters and your username is 20. So SMS, I mean, the first use of Twitter at South by Southwest was all, can you imagine today if Twitter was on your SMS, like how much your phone would be buzzing? We forget that Twitter started as SMS. These were all baby steps. They were all incremental ways to be audacious. So when I talk to startups these days, I spend a lot of time on their technology and so on. They say, what are your baby steps to get to the eventual goal? What's your equivalent of the Tesla sports car or the Netflix envelope or the SMS instead of app? And if they can't answer that, they probably need to spend a lot more time thinking about that because otherwise they're making a really big bet, but they haven't figured out the steps to get there and how to instrument those steps for adoption. In each of these cases, the company was able to test market, technology, wherever their uncertainty was, before they invested a lot in it. I think when you talk about Amazon building drones, it sounds like a stupid idea until you realize that most of the world's population is moving into dense buildings. I was speaking at DHL's innovation conference and they said to me in their best German, Alistair, we would like you to talk about vertical logistics. And I said, oh, you mean like logistics for education, for healthcare? And they said, no, you idiot. We spend most of our time going up and down elevators. So if I said to you, Bezos' plan wasn't just drones, it was like a truck that pulls up next to your building, the roof opens up, and drones drop packages off on balconies and go home, maybe that's a little more reasonable. A lot of these audacious things start out really small. And you know, the irony of all this is that the FAA is turns out Amazon's biggest enemy, because they were fighting them on Kindles on planes, and now they're fighting them with drones in buildings. Markets tend to get disrupted by data. In the early days of the radio, broadcasters in North America needed to figure out how to charge for advertising. And so they gave people these little books, listening diaries they were called. And so they'd give 100 Hispanic men aged 25 to 35 a diary, and they'd fill out every half hour what they listened to. Radio stations quickly got wise to this stuff. They would start to do things like, they knew that the most coveted advertising slots were 7:15 to 7:45, so they'd run contests at 7:28 every morning, because that way you filled in the radio for both of those blocks. They knew people waited until the weekend to fill out their listening diaries, so on Friday they would repeat the radio station's call sign a lot more. Huge overstatement of market share for the leading markets. In 2008, Arbitron came out with this device called a Personal Performance Meter, or PPM. Sits on your hip. Every radio station has a unique signature that we can't hear, but this thing can, and it measures what you listen to. So if you walk into a mall and listen to country music for 15 minutes, you're a country and western listener for those 15 minutes. It can also tell what song makes you change the channel. Almost overnight, when this came out, Arbitron went from quarterly reports to instantaneous knowledge about what people were listening to, backed up every day or every week. All the radio stations that had these 50% market shares went down to 30. Data completely disrupts markets, and you're in the middle of one of the biggest disruptions in time. This isn't always good. If you want to know why pop music sucks today, remember, this thing knows what song you were listening to when you changed the channel. And so when there was a song in heavy rotation in 2007, it was played every 4 to 5 hours. A song in heavy rotation today is played every 55 minutes. Radio stations are flourishing, but this is the kind of change that happens when data comes about. So I'm going to run you through some tools and some sort of things you can take home with you, because you're probably all feeling like full sponges at this point. We don't normally endorse products. However, a lot of people say to us, what tools do you use? So here is a glorious list of a few that you can look at. If you want to know about them, they're in the slide deck. Many of them are mentioned there. We try really hard to give you high-level concepts, not specifics, but there are a number of tools. The one statement I will make is that in the old days, analytics was one size fits all. Now it's becoming verticalized. So, for example, Flurry does mobility. Totango does software as a service. Parsley does publishing. So there's things about specific verticals for which certain kinds of tools are more applicable. Kissmetrics is very focused on conversion optimization, for example. Mixpanel's focused on the health of cohorts over time. So there are tools that have a specific angle. Hopefully, because of this presentation, you now understand some of what I'm talking about here. One of the things that often comes up is people say, I don't know how to draw a line in the sand, how can I? One of the things you can do, and this is a bit of stats, but it works okay, is let's say you've got a company and they're trying to drive enrollment. At first, out of 1,200 visitors, only 0.3% sign up. So over on the left, you saw the number of visits that are coming in, and the enrollments is the red line. And we gradually improve the conversion rate. So you can see that green line is kind of the conversion rate getting better. So by the end of the month, I'm converting 8.2% of my visitors. Should I keep going? Am I at a point of diminishing returns? You can do the stats on this. You can kind of plot a trend line like this and say, based on that trend line, I'm going to max out around 9%. So I don't have a line in the sand, but I can see where I am on a point of diminishing returns. So in the absence of something else, it makes sense to analyze the metric and say, let's plot a trend on that thing and see if we're at a point of diminishing returns. It's not always accurate, but if you don't have a line in the sand, this is a good place to start. To answer that question earlier about vanity metrics, the way I tend to do it with people, unless it's a contrarian metric where the vanity metric looked really good, but it's actually bad, like Nigerian spam, is that my goal, we all agree, is to produce some kind of an outcome. Someone bought a thing, or they invited a friend, or whatever. If the outcome requires an action and vanity moves people towards that, it's okay for the vanity, right? Web traffic might be something you celebrate, but you have to explain to the world how that vanity metric of web traffic is tied to activation based on cart size times conversion rate, which drives revenue. And if you explain something simple like that to the person who's out celebrating the vanity metrics, then you can help them to understand why that number, yeah, it's great that we got that number, but we need to focus on cart size, for example. Something else that I've kind of worked on recently, this isn't in the book, but a number of accelerators have asked me, how do I put together a way of tracking progress for my startups in my portfolio over time when they're changing their metrics all the time? So it's very hard for me to say, are you doing well, when you were working on customer lifetime value one week and then you're working on, virality the next week and so on. So basically, your business model, the stage you're at, and your one metric change very often. So how do you track that over time, especially across a portfolio? One of the things that seems to work is what we call traction graphs. So let's say this is my company over time, and for the first month and a half, I'm working on signups per day. So I can draw a graph like this. This is my target. Did I get there? And then I can say there's conversion rate, and then I can say there's churn rate, and then I can say there's viral coefficient. And if we all agree on what the line in the sand should be and the progress towards it, I can give my board or my executive team a graph like this. The problem, of course, if you want to quantify this, is that this axis over on the left changes for each of these metrics. So if you want to be a little geeky about it, what you can actually do is you can look at whether the change in that thing is positive or negative. So a traction graph might say, this is the metric, this is what I was working on. I should always be above 0%. That shows I'm improving. Now, if something dips below 0%, like over here, I can say, well, what happened to conversion rate? Well, if you look at the previous graph, you can see there's a period here where I really screwed up. I massively destroyed conversion rate before fixing it, right? So if I have a graph like that and I want to roll up this stuff, I can say, show me the health of the progress you're making, and basically whatever metric we've agreed on, if you're seeing an incremental improvement, measurement to measurement above the line, it's okay. When you drop below the 0% line, we have to talk. Another technique that we've used, something we call the 3 3s, this is a way of managing things, and it ties very closely to the sort of lean canvas model, is you're making 3 big assumptions. I like 3s, they're a nice number to get your head around. You're making 3 big assumptions. People will answer questions, organizers are frustrated with how they run conferences, we'll make money from parents, whatever. You come up with 3 actions you're going to take to make these assumptions happen or test them, and that leads to 3 experiments to run, which may be feature tests, continuous deployment, A/B testing. So for example, these tend to be a monthly set of assumptions that the board buys into. This is like, these are our business assumptions. Weekly actions the executive team is going to give to the organization, and then experiments we run. In the military, they talk about strategy, operations, and tactics. So that's a good sort of trifecta as well. So in the local mind model, we might say many people will answer questions from strangers. What are the 3 actions we could take to follow up on that? We want to get more people, increase the answer percentage, and test better questions. And based on increasing answer percentage, maybe we're going to change the UI, we're going to test the timing, we're going to try testing sending questions from peers. So if each week, each month the board agrees on the assumptions, if each week the executive team agrees on the operational stuff, and then on a daily basis you're doing this sort of tactical experimentation, that tends to lead to the kind of behavior and pace that you want to see as a startup. One of the things that Ben came up with, we call the problem solution canvas. This is very close to Ash Moira's stuff. But the PS canvas basically says, here's our current status, what metric are we tracking, and how are they trending? Very small boxes, because that way you're brief. Last week's lessons learned and accomplishments. What did you learn? What did you do? Are you on track or not? And then for each of your 3 problems that we just outlined, these are the solutions we're hypothesizing. This is the metric we're going to collect, and this is the line in the sand. One other little caveat, you can use proxy data, just be really careful. There's a famous line, you could call this Bayes' theorem, a subjective degree of belief should rationally change to account for evidence. According to the data, the city of Oakland has a hotbed of crime in Oakland Hills, and the flats are pretty safe. Anybody here live in Oakland? The reason for that is that if you leave a mattress out in Oakland Hills, everyone calls the cops. If you leave a mattress out in the flats, people have a nap. So when you have a proxy for data, like crime reports, for example, and you will find many examples of proxy data you're collecting, you need to temper that with real world stuff. I talked about the bump map example in Boston. Another good example, when the Red Cross is looking at disease outbreaks in Haiti, one of the things they looked at was the movement of cell phones across towers, because that showed that a population was mobile. And when all the people in one town stopped moving, they assumed there was a sickness there. Now, one of the things that can happen in flooding is the water table rises and it causes the rise of a lot of diseases like cholera and so on. And so at one point after a flood, there was this one town that nobody was moving and they were about to send in the Red Cross until some field researcher said, wait a minute, guys, the bridge is washed out. So you really need to temper that quantitative stuff with qualitative stuff. A lot of people think once I've got scale, all I need to do is just measure the numbers. No, Kyle learned to move his line because he picked up the phone and called someone. And the last real lesson here is to think subversively. The city of Houston had a problem with the delivery of baggage. It was the number one cause of complaints. When they asked people, what's the problem you guys are facing? What did you think about traveling through our airport? Number one complaint, I had to wait too long for my bags. It took 9 minutes for the bags to get from the plane to the carousel. So they implemented a huge program to overhaul the conveyor belt system. They got the time it took the bags to go from the plane to the carousel down to 6 minutes. That's a Sisyphean effort. It's huge. Number one cause of complaints after they fixed this, I have to wait too long for my bags. And then some enterprising civil servant got permission to park the planes farther from the gate, from the carousel. Complaints went to zero. What people said was, I don't like to wait for my bags, not I mind walking, right? If you're the person designing that test and you have two possibilities, one is I'm going to spend millions of dollars of taxpayers' money to overhaul the system. The other is I'm going to park the planes. I'm going to test those two things, right? I mean, maybe what that makes you realize is you need entertainment at the carousel or something, but which of those tests is easier? Which one's lazy? You've got to think subversively when running these tests. So in conclusion, Lloyd Nelson famously says the most important things that matter are the ones that are unknowable, but you still got to try. Everybody here has heard the story of Archimedes, right? So Archimedes worked for a vengeful, spiteful king. The king gave someone some gold and said, make me a crown. The crown came back. The king went, it feels a little light. Hey, Archie, tell me if I'm being ripped off here. Archimedes was like, well, I can measure things weight, but that's an irregularly shaped solid. And I can't really measure volume. How will I do this? Let me go sit and think in a bath. So he sat in a bath. The water went up. He went, Eureka, I have it, ran through the streets naked, going, I've figured out how to measure the volume of an irregular solid by displacement. I may be paraphrasing a little bit. And there's good evidence that he actually understood the science of it and had another way of doing it, but that's the story. It's a nice story. And by the way, the guy was lying and the king had his head chopped off. I told you he was a vengeful king. But the bottom line here is that Archimedes had taken baths before. I mean, I assume he wasn't like a smelly old philosopher. He'd taken baths before. The Greeks loved their baths. Archimedes was literally sitting in the answer. We live in a world that's so full of data, so abundant of data. The problem is not the answer. It's all around us. The hardest problem is knowing what question to ask. Which metric should I track? What's the right ratio? Which test should I run? And so on. Once upon a time, a leader was the person who convinced others to act in the absence of information. And today, a leader, a founder, a smart business person is the one who knows which questions to ask. So with that, we got time for a few questions. That's Ben. He's the smart one. I'm the loud one. You can yell at us on Twitter or here or by email. But if you got questions online or in person, I'm happy to take them.
We had a couple questions online, one of which I think you covered, so I will kind of paraphrase the first, and then if you have questions in the room, raise your hand, and I'll come around to you. And it was, you briefly talked about it when you showed that graph, and there was a little thing that said pivot. So the question was, what if you're optimizing toward that one metric that matters, 6 months go by, and you're not making progress? How do you know when to decide to try something else?
So it's a really good question. How do you know when to pivot? I believe that there are three kinds of innovation. There's Clay Christensen talks about sustaining innovation, which is more of the same. So just do what you're doing now, only faster. There's adjacent innovation, which means I'm going to change to a new product or a new market, or I tend to think to a new method. And then there's disruptive innovation, which is do something entirely different. And the question is really how much innovation. So pivoting often involves taking what you got and saying, is there an adjacent market, is there an adjacent product, or is there an adjacent method of delivery? I saw one company that was flailing in the HR space. They're in the book, the name ClearHire, I think they're called, ClearHire Data. And they were charging a monthly fee for listing employee recruiting posts for companies. And then they just changed to, we're going to charge $300 a listing, and their revenue went through the roof. So all they did there was change the way they charged for their service. So the first thing is, you're sitting here, it's not working, it's been 6 months, people are upset. What are the adjacent products, methods, or markets that you can test? And then start testing those, right? I mean, there's no reason to not be trying to, it's like rock climbing. You can take one limb off the wall with relative safety. I think the right answer is start looking creatively around adjacent products, adjacent markets, or adjacent methods in the space you're in now. Because to take everything and throw it all away is difficult. You've probably got something useful in there, some core value. The trick is to really rethink it along one of those dimensions.
Questions in the room? Take another one online. What are some ideas, best practices for re-engaging disengaged users? So when you look at the kind of cohorts, you see some people
Right.
that have lost
So
you. What do you do?
I always think that if you're going to try and convince someone to taste it again for the first time, you have to be able to tell them something's changed. One of the things I encourage founders to do is, don't tell everyone all the benefits in the first time. You just tell them enough. Save some other stuff. Because if I have 50 features and I don't know, and I know that you haven't tried 10 of them, then I could easily say, hey, come back and try this new thing we've added, right? Whereas if I tell you everything up front. So a lot of times, and I think Neil Patel does a good job of talking about this, one of the few people who deserves to be called a growth hacker in a good way, that you have to figure out the long-term engagement and re-engagement pattern of your interaction with the user, rather than just shooting it all at once and saying, here it is, and then you got nothing left. Part of that might be that you only show them some of the features, and then by week 3 you go, hey, did you know we have this other thing? And they have another moment of surprise and delight. So all of those things, you think about wooing someone. You don't propose on the first date. You kind of make sure dinner was good. Build that process over time. The second thing is earn the right to reach out to them. So if you give them a good experience, if you gave them value, then you've got their contact information. I mean, the two most significant sources of churn are, number one, the person leaves the company, so their email doesn't work anymore, and number two, their credit card expires. It sounds like a great idea to say, I'm going to get a year's worth of your payment up front instead of paying monthly, but that means you're going to find out up to 12 months late that they left. So you've actually, by taking money up front, you've dramatically reduced your ability to tell whether something you did broke stuff. So it's a combination of, have you earned the right to repeatedly contact the customer? Have you got useful stuff to re-engage with them so you're not just spamming them? And do you have good sensors in place, sort of early warning sensors, to find out if they're going dark?
All right. We got one more. We'll take one more question in the room here. Bring the mic around.
So let's talk about the case where you have more questions to answer that the people to ask them to. So what's a good framework to pick questions? Like, as in, how do you go about, right?
I'm gonna. You know what my answer is going to be, right? That's the hard part. If it was easy, I'd just take 50% of your shares and tell you. So the reality is, you've always got more questions than answers.
Right.
The answer about what question is most important comes from your business model. You have a fundamental business model. Which parts of the real world the business model is your stated ideal world. Mm-hmm. Right? I'm going to buy lemons for $5. I'm going to sell them for 10 in the form of lemonade. That's my business model. Right? And maybe I have some assumptions about how many people walk past my stand, what percentage buy, how much they pay, that my mom will continue to give me cups and markers for free. Those are my assumptions. Where is it flaming red wrong? Because that's the place you need to investigate. And this takes a lot of discipline, because you may want to put out 10 fires. You need to know which one's going to blow up the house, right? And so when you have more questions than you have people, it probably means you're still in the qualitative stage. You're going to have a very consultative engagement. And when you are a B2B product, business to business, you often start out by doing what looks a lot like consulting, but trying to find the 20% of features that 80% of your customers want, and constantly saying no to customization or creating APIs the customer can extend themselves. And then your metric for stickiness are things like trouble ticket support, the time to integrate stuff. Your measurements for things like virality are, will someone act as a reference or case study, testimonial. And so you have these proxies that are very similar to the B2C ones, but because you're selling B2B, it's much more consultative early on. Mm-hmm. And that's the challenge, is to make sure that consultation leads to a standardized product for a large market. Otherwise, you're just building a consulting business that has some code.
All right, thank you.
A first idea, the problem is your tendency is to want to go build it. So if you look at this cycle that Eric Ries puts together, in that cycle, hey, everyone's idea is the best idea, right? I mean, that's just a given. And people love the part where they build it, because they came from maker backgrounds or engineering backgrounds. We want to build something tangible. It's a nice, reliable, mental model. It makes our amygdala all happy that we've got this real thing in front of us. we tend not to measure it or put it in measurement as an afterthought, and as a result, there's not a lot of data as we cycle around this thing, and our goal is to fix that, because analytics is kind of like your therapist. Analytics can tell you when you're delusional. It can help you understand whether you're right or not. And so the best way to think about analytics is it's essentially the measurement of the movement of your community, your users, your revenue towards the business goals you've set for yourself. And in a startup, that means that it has a very specific role, which is to help you find the legendary, mythical product market fit unicorn before you run out of money or before your investors lose patience with you. We are terrible at doing metrics, so I'm going to use an example for this. I have 2 kids. At least one of them is a girl. What are the chances that the other one is a boy? How many people say 50%? Does anybody want to chime in? How many people on the Hangout think it's 50%? I have 2 kids. At least one of them's a girl. What are the chances the other's a girl? How many people would like to say it's 50%, but they know I'm tricking them? Right. So this is a great example of how bad we are at data. Will you all agree with me that I have 4 possible combinations? Boy, boy, girl, girl, boy, girl, girl, boy. Those are the 4 possible permutations of birth I might have, correct? I said at least one was a girl, so we know it's not this one. Of the remaining ones, how many are boys? 66%. That's a pretty simple question. Someone says to you, I have 2 kids, at least one's a girl. Your temptation is to say, oh, there's an equal chance the other one is a boy or a girl. But because I said the words at least, I've conveyed 16% inaccuracy on what you thought was the state of the world. We are terrible at data. So even when you're doing data collection, these kinds of paradoxes and problems, you've probably heard of things like the Monty Hall problem, Bayesian statistics. There's lots and lots of stuff that can trip us up. And we have to be very disciplined about how we capture data and what we do about data. So before we get too deep into lean analytics, I'm going to give you some examples. By the way, this is called the 2-child paradox. I actually have one daughter. She's at the Academy of Sciences, having a great time without me right now. But this kind of stuff trips us up. This is called the 2-child paradox. If you Google it, it's quite interesting. Or you could Bing it. That'd be fine too. So there's, whoa, cold crowd. So here's some fundamentals. First of all, do I have to put like money in a jar when I do that? Is that? So what makes a good metric if you're trying to understand your business? First of all, a metric has got to be understandable. Those that had the experience of the May app, which may have been awesome, the purple stuff, had a very different set of experiences from those that came in my ugly January minimum viable product. So we call that a cohort when you slice across that longitudinally. I apologize if you understand stats really well and know this stuff, but it's worth stating. A cohort is a group that has something in common across its lifespan. In this case, they had an experience with my April product. And then I may slice across these things cross-sectionally instead of longitudinally, and I have segments of groups. So I may say all the people that came to my website on a sunny day versus a cloudy day, or all the people whose name begins with A versus B, whatever that segment is. And I may manufacture those in the forms of tests. So A/B tests. I think there's a Google blog post called 50,000 Shades of Blue about optimizing the right color for search results. Basically, this is tests that you can enforce. Most of us are not lucky enough to have the volume of traffic of a Google, which will allow us to do very simple, quick A/B tests. And so we tend to resort to multivariate analysis, where we have several different things we think are somehow correlated with a particular outcome. And so we run a multivariate test, let's say sunny and cloudy days, and whether they saw a red or green button. And then we do regression to figure out which ones correlate with the behavior we want, someone spending money or clicking on a search link or inviting a friend. So this basic taxonomy is pretty important. Cohorts, cross-sectional analysis or segmentation, multivariate testing, A/B testing. Let me give an example of why it's important. I'm going to show you 2 companies. You tell me which one's doing better. So here's our first company. This company is getting 1,000 new users a month. In the first month, the average revenue per customer is $5. The next month, the revenue per customer drops to $4.50, then $4.33, then $4.25, recovers a little in May to $4.50. Show of hands here or online, if you want to just type in whether you think so or not. How many people think this company is doing really well? How many people think this company is doing really badly? How many people think this company is stagnating? So it's interesting, you guys said there's not enough data. What's missing? I said it's 1,000 a month. How many people think it's doing really well? Stagnating? Badly? Most people say stagnating. I'll show you a second company, okay? In this case, I'm going to show you the data a little differently. So in this case, I'm going to map the data to cohorts. Here's a company, and in January, these are the users that show up in January, they get $5 a customer. And over the next 5 months, the revenue they get from those customers who had the lousy experience with the January cohort, that drops to about 50 cents. Next month, February, so it's the second month here, those users bring in $6 in their first month, so that's good. The next month it goes up to 7, then 8, and finally. So my name's Alistair. I'm going to talk to you about lean analytics. You're probably sick of the word lean already, almost as sick as you are the word growth hacker. So I'm going to avoid terms like that too much. How many people here have read the book, The Lean Startup? How many people here have finished reading the book, The Lean Startup? See, I know from all the Kindles how many chapters people get through on our book, and you can actually do like a histogram of page completion, and we put Easter eggs in the book, and every now and then we get like a tweet that says, hey, I read the Easter egg, which is a great way to test whether things are out there, because we analyze everything. We're analytics guys. So Ben and I wrote this book because we found that the Lean Startup was a great model, but people wanted more depth on the measurement phase, so I'm going to talk about that a bit. I'm going to assume that you guys have a good sense of what startups are, the basic ideas behind lean. The most fundamental idea behind the lean startup movement is that Kevin Costner is a lousy entrepreneur. Because if you remember the movie The Field of Dreams, the premise of the movie was if you build it, they will come. The reality should be if they come, you will build it. And so you should not sell what you can make, but rather make what you can sell. And the lean startup is really a system for making sure that happens. This is the core message behind the Lean Startup book that Eric Ries wrote, that everything is a constant cycle of building, measuring, and learning, and your ability to iterate through this cycle as quickly as possible with the most learning possible will give you the greatest likelihood of success. This is pretty common evidence. The problem with this, of course, is that we have very few ideas about what we're going to be when we wind up being a full-fledged company. So, for example, PayPal was originally built to do payment across Palm Pilots. FreshBooks was a web design firm that had a problem with its invoicing systems. Wikipedia was going to be written by experts only. Mitel was one of my favorite examples, is a lawnmower company, Mike and Terry's Lawnmowers. That's Michael Copeland and Terry Matthews. That's why the logo looks like spinning blades, by the way. Hotmail was a database company. You guys have probably heard the apocryphal story. These two people wanted to work at their day jobs and communicate about this database they were building, and DFJ didn't care about the database. They cared about the fact that these guys could use their email from work and circumvent the company. Flickr was going to be a massively multiplayer online game. Twitter was a podcasting company. Autodesk, if you've ever wondered why it has a name like that, was initially making desktop automation software. So none of these companies, that you've probably heard of most of them, had any idea what they were really going to be, or at best they had a sort of hypothesis that they want to go test. And the reason that we need a lean startup model that is sort of driven by informed learnings from metric is because we're all liars. And I put myself in that camp too, but we are all self-delusional. We love to build things. We're convinced that we're the right person, we're the smartest person, and why can't these people possibly understand me? Now, you guys have already cleared at least one hurdle, which is that you've managed to convince people like Ken that either he has similar delusions or you have some evidence that you're right. But when you have their customers buy again in 90 days, it's very small. There's nothing wrong with being loyalty or acquisition focused. There's everything wrong with not knowing which category you're in. So that's the kind of metric you need to spend time looking at in business. Some other important aspects of analytics. Analytics is often about blending qualitative and quantitative metrics. Often earlier stage in the life cycle of the company, you're doing a lot of qualitative discovery, user interviews, open-ended questions, exploratory stuff. Later on, you're trying to quantify that stuff into much bigger groups. You're trying to be analytical. But there is a very important need for both, and you need to compare across them to get information. The city of Boston issued an app called Bump Map that basically sat in your car, used the smartphone app to measure whether you hit potholes. They got a heat map of where to fix potholes in the city. What it did was tell them which roads in rich neighborhoods they should repair, because only rich people had unlimited data smartphone plans and a good smartphone in their car when they weren't riding on a bus to work. Here's a great example where the quantitative data said these are where all the potholes are. But if you temper that with qualitative data, like I went and looked and there's a lot of potholes in the poor neighborhoods, all of a sudden you realize your algorithms are wrong. So anytime you're looking at quantitative data, it's very important to temper that with qualitative data. There's another important aspect of the data you're going to collect. Some of it is exploratory, and some of it is reporting data. Exploratory data is the interesting, cool stuff that shows you the what-ifs. Reporting data is the stuff that becomes managed by exceptions, sort of set the alert and don't think about it. The person who knew the most about this, of all people, was Donald Rumsfeld. I'm channeling Avinash Kaushik talking about Donald Rumsfeld. But Rumsfeld once said, hey, there's things we know, which are facts, which we may want to check, but they're facts. We consider them to be true. There's things we know we don't know. These are questions like, what was sales last week? Those are boring. They're not going to change my behavior, except maybe firing the salesperson. But I do need to report them, and I do need to pass them on to accounting. There's things we don't know we know. That's intuition. It's sort of muscle memory. It needs to be communicated to the team. It needs to be quantified. It needs to be codified into processes. And then there's things we don't know, and this is exploration. This is usually where where competitive advantage comes from, because you're finding insights in the data you didn't know were there. So metrics tend to fall into one of these categories. I'm going to explain some stuff that might seem basic, but I want to review it. Imagine I have a web application, and it has 1,000 users a month that sign up for it. And in my first month, I get 1,000 users in January, and the product's not so great, so they come in, and most of them leave over the period of the next 2 or 3 months. And then the next month, I launch another version of my product that's better, so these users tend to stick around for a little longer, and then the March users stick around for a little longer still, and here's my April users, my May users. So usage patterns tend to look like this. Now, the user's goal of a metric is to produce some change. And if your metrics aren't understandable, or they're understandable to you but nobody else, they're not good. This is a hard test because everyone thinks their metrics are understandable. They should be no more complicated than a golf score. Bowling scores are more complicated than golf scores. So you need a really, really simple metric if it's going to produce change within an organization. It should be comparative. Without context for knowing what it's compared to, your competitors, last month, whatever else, it's not very useful. It's usually a ratio or a rate. Miles per hour is a more useful metric than miles when it comes to driving a car. But finally, and most importantly, it is behavior changing. A good metric will fundamentally change your behavior. The simplest rule for analytics is if it won't change your behavior, it is a bad metric. You may need to collect some forms of data for your accountant, or to make sure that the website is up, but it's not changing your behavior until it goes down. But fundamentally, when you're spending time on metrics, ask yourself, what will I do if they are one way or another? And if you don't have an answer, you probably shouldn't waste your time, and you should find better metrics. If a metric won't change your behavior, it is a bad metric. Metrics really help you know yourself. And yet, when we interviewed people for the book, we found that most people don't spend a lot of time looking at those metrics. For example, here's a way of understanding the metrics that your business might have, looking at the customers that are going to buy from you a second time within 90 days. Let's say you're a retail store. If your customers buy from you, if less than 15% of your customers buy from you within a 90-day window, you are what's called an acquisition mode e-commerce company. If they buy from you, if more than 30% of them buy from you within a 90-day window, you are a loyalty mode e-commerce company. There's nothing bad about being in acquisition mode or loyalty mode. Acquisition mode companies, for example, diamond ring merchants. Someone's buying from you more than once a year. There's probably something strange about that customer, a little bit creepy. On the other hand, if you're a grocery retailer, someone might be buying food from you once or twice a week. Very high loyalty focus. Nothing wrong with being one or the other. But once you measure what percentage of your customers buy from you a second time in 90 days, that changes your entire marketing outlook. Because if you are a loyalty-focused company, you want to focus on things like favorites lists and variety of selection and loyalty. You want to have wish lists. If someone calls you and says, my fruit was rotten, you immediately send them a basket because you want them to be a customer for life. On the other hand, if you're an acquisition-focused, you focus on your customer cost of acquisition, maximizing checkout amount. Maybe you're selling ring cleaning and ring insurance services for your wedding rings. You do not accept refunds. Very different marketing behaviors that come from a metric like this. Astonishingly, the number of e-commerce retailers I've talked to that actually know what percentage